I just released another true crime story about the recent case of Dylan Rounds and his mysterious disappearance. It can be viewed on my new channel, Donovan Dread True Crime. It's a fascinating story and the links are below. I love visiting Zion National Park. The canyons there are beyond beautiful. I don't go as often now, but about 20 years ago I was still going there every summer and doing some camping and hiking. Sometimes I would bring friends. A couple of times I brought my siblings when we could all take a break from our busy lives. But one trip in the summer of 2002 is when I decided to go at it alone. I wanted to make my own rules about how long I hiked and where I went. I also was very considerate of other people, especially out in the elements. But I like to push myself, so solo trips were my favorite. This time I didn't even take my dog. So I wasn't limited to just one trail. It was just me in the outdoors and maybe some other hikers doing their own thing. There was an area of the canyons where an old cabin stood for years and years, as long as I'd been going to the park. I was so used to going by this cabin that I never really thought twice about anyone living there. It was so dilapidated and the musty smell of the wood was so hard to miss just passing through. There was no way anyone would survive in there, or so I thought. On this trip, as I passed the cabin, I was overcome with dread. Something was terribly off. At first, I didn't even think of the cabin because it was just such a part of the landscape. But as I turned to it and looked at it, I noticed that for the first time ever, the door was cracked open. This was very odd because I'd never seen the cabin open before. I looked around, but I didn't see anybody. Not one other hiker or tourist was coming out this way. Something bad was in there, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I started towards the cabin slowly, but then turned around to leave when I got cold feet. That's when I heard a horrifying sound come from inside. I turned back around, and my heart stopped completely now. I couldn't move. I tried to rationalize the sound I heard, but nothing made sense. It was a muffled scream followed by what could have been a giggle, but the two sounds together were enough to make the hair on my neck stand up. This went on for several seconds, and then there was silence again. In fact, so much silence that I could tell all the wildlife had left this area. I didn't know what to think or do, so I slowly approached the door again. When I got to it, it was still only open about 2 inches, but I couldn't get myself together in order to push it open anymore. It was almost as if my feet were suddenly filled with cement. I finally worked up the courage to push it open, slowly raising my hand to it. As soon as my hand touched the knob, there was a creaking noise as the door jerked open by itself. My heart jumped into my throat now, and through sheer adrenaline, I stepped forward into the cabin, ready to see what was hiding inside. That was a stupid idea. I heard no voices or laughter or muffled screams, but I gasped as I looked around the cabin. Hanging from the ceiling and pretty much anywhere you could hang something were these old moldy dolls. Some had their eyes plucked out. Some were covered in a rust-colored liquid that had dried. Some had no hair. They were all pointing their baby-like faces at the doorway. I couldn't breathe as I took in the sight. There had to be hundreds of them, all different sizes. It's all I remember before I heard another giggle from right beside me. That was enough, and I turned around and ran, never looking back to see if I could see the person living in there. Years later, I still feel a coldness when I pass by that cabin, and every time the memory comes to mind. The next time I went with friends, I searched the cabin myself and found nothing. No dolls, no rust-colored liquid. It was like it never happened. I don't know who was hiding in the shadows when I saw those dolls, but I'm so grateful I got out of there with my life. It was truly a terrifying experience. Weird things happen in this world, and it's not always easily explained. In order to get into Zion National Park without long lines and tons of cars, they began a daily shuttle service last year. It finally gave me a reason to go. as I was always concerned about how crowded it would be. The shuttles were crowded too, but at least I could stay all day and avoid the families going home earlier in the evening. I planned to take the last shuttle back to the parking lot in the town of Springdale. It would be about 9 p.m. when I got back. I was on the shuttle back with only 2 other people who were a pair. It had rained a little, so a lot of the people had gone home a bit early. It was late summer, and because of the heat, I dried off and kept hiking instead, braving some slippery conditions along the way. A little rain never hurt anyone though, and I wanted to see everything. This was the park on my hiking bucket list. When the shuttle dropped us off, the 2 other travelers went together and disappeared into the town. I figured they were locals when I saw where they went, and then saw that my car was the only one left in the lot. I, on the other hand, had to get into my car and still drive 30 minutes to the lodge I was staying at. I pulled out my keys and walked over to my small car, sitting alone in the middle of everything. There was one street lamp over this parking area that illuminated this area that was just paved. The brush around the lot was black. I pressed the button on my key fob to unlock my car, and then suddenly something in the bushes was startled by the noise. I heard some cries that sounded like an elk, but it was like 3 or 4 of them overlapping. It actually sounded terrifying. I crouched behind the driver's side of my car when I figured out which way it was coming from. I was hoping I could get my door open and make a quick getaway, but I became frozen when the thing making the noise stepped out into the light. It looked like this tall, ghostly man, bulky on top, with these skinny legs. It moved like it was struggling to escape from a straitjacket. Its feet were planted to the pavement, but its upper half was like wrestling with itself. It started walking towards me, still moving that way. I could see while peeking through my car window that its face was blank. There was nothing on it, no features. But the screams came right from it, even with no mouth. It kept coming towards the car, but at the same pace as it began with. I thought I was going to die. If not from the thing itself, then from a heart attack. My car started beeping, and then the light on my key fob was blinking red. My battery light started blinking too. I couldn't look anymore, so I sat with my back against the car and my eyes closed, praying it would go away. After a minute, all the sounds, the screaming, and the car noises stopped. I didn't feel like anyone was there anymore. It just grew quiet. Then the quiet was interrupted with this simple hooting of an owl. I almost jumped out of my skin. Then the crickets began. It was like everything was returning to normal. I slowly peeked through the car window again, and nothing was there. Not even the brush beyond the light was moving. I didn't want to stick around to find out where it went or what it was, so I jumped in my car and took off. I've never in my life seen anything like that outside of some horror movie, and it was so weird that it was in a parking lot. In the fall of 2014, I got myself a permit to camp in the more primitive areas of the Grand Canyon National Park. I wanted to see more of the wild and less of the tourists. All year round, the dry park is pretty busy, but if you know where to pitch a tent and hide yourself, you can make the park your own. Of course, I get the rundown from the rangers about the dry weather conditions and making sure I know where my car is. I knew that I would be miles from the more convenient areas of the park. I understood that, and I hiked my way into the park, avoiding people every chance I got. I came upon an area way in from the trail that had a tiny clearing surrounded by trees, a rarity in the park that was mostly desert. I felt so relieved for the tree cover and that no one had found it first. I set up my tent, made a small charcoal fire on my portable grill, and enjoyed my little corner of the park. Luckily, the fire restrictions were lifted a bit as the nights got colder. I just had to be careful. The first night was spent with a few beers and a guitar. I was happy. The next day, I hiked a few places around the canyon, seeing sights and even saying hello to a few strangers. regardless of how much I really didn't want to talk to anyone. I was just in kind of a jolly mood. That second night, I basically repeated the first as I reached my camp. Beer, guitar, a small fire. As the night went on, I remember crickets and other nocturnal bugs getting louder and louder, which made guitar a little difficult. I decided to set it down for the night, finally around midnight. The fire was burning out anyway, and I was getting tired. I put out the rest of the embers, making sure that the coals were nice and cold before I went to bed. I didn't want any accidents. I laid down in my tent to sleep. The flaps in the entryway to the tent were more see-through, but there was nothing but darkness now over the whole area. I was looking forward to the sleep after a day of hiking, when suddenly a light appeared through the fabric in the tent. I thought maybe I left an ember burning. I rolled out of bed and unzipped the tent to find nothing but darkness. The coals were cold to the touch now, so the light must have been from someone else. I took out my flashlight and looked around. There was no one camping anywhere near me. I turned off my flashlight, chalking it up to just seeing things, when suddenly I look up and I see this bright light in the branches of the trees above me. It looked like a bright star, and I thought that's what I was seeing in between the branches, but then it moved. It had no edges and would wax and wane as it floated there, which was an odd behavior for a star. Then it moved. It moved fast. It moved all around the camp with me watching. The light was white and circular, still wobbling from big to small, with edges never clear. I had no idea what to make of it. It reminded me of something out of Close Encounters. But nothing like this has ever happened to me before. I was fascinated, but also a little concerned that something was out there watching me. I braved the rest of the night and returned to the inside of my tent, zipping it back up. Whatever it was remained out there, but it felt more curious than angry. Another few minutes of seeing the light continue to float around over me, almost observing me. It shot off into the night sky, leaving a glowing circular trail behind it. It was so bright that it could be seen right through the tent fabric. I laid back in my tent wide-eyed. It was gone. That calmed me down, and eventually I drifted off to sleep. I woke up early the next morning, packed up, and kept hiking. I remember feeling a little more on edge after that light show, but since I woke up in one piece, I didn't feel threatened. I just felt weird after that, like there were eyes in those lights, and they were always watching me. It made me think a lot about the people who go missing in parks. I wonder if they see the light and don't go back in their own tents. I was camping with my wife in the Grand Canyon National Park. We stayed at an established campground, but we were booked there for a week, so we thought one night we would sneak off and camp away from everyone else. I figured as someone who was used to camping and hiking, it would be easy to find a spot just for one night that would be safe. The park gets cold at night, so we started our search for the perfect little private spot at dusk. With the summer sun still in the sky, and tourists still sparsely exploring around us on their way back to camp, we found a place on the open ground with views of rock formations all around us. It felt safe, like we were in our own little container. That was until I heard something echoing off the rocks that I was not expecting. At first, I assumed it was an animal of some kind. There are bighorn sheep in the park, so we thought it was them calling out to one another. But then the echoing became too clear and distinct. It was only coming from one voice, and it sounded like an animal the louder it got. It was like a mumbling noise now, but my wife pointed out she could make out a melody. We stood there in silence in the dark and listened intently. The echo it made off the rocks was something otherworldly, but the voice was human-like. Then we figured it out. Someone or something was singing. I have been in the woods my whole life, and I have never heard anything like it. As quickly as we figured out what the noise was, it stopped. We didn't make out the song or anything the first time, and we figured it was just some kids camping somewhere around us or goofing off. That was until it started again, this time sounding closer. This time we could make out that it was definitely words, not humming. It was a man for sure, but his voice sounded high. He seemed to be singing in some ancient language. I've heard some pretty old songs in my life, but this wasn't one of them. I can't recall how the song went to this day, but I remember whatever was singing it was doing so in one breath, almost professionally. My wife kept trying to write it off as some kids, but when we had settled at dusk, there was no one around us. And after taking out my flashlight, I still couldn't spot anything out on the plains except for some lone trees. The singing would get louder, then quiet, then louder still. Then it started moving. We could hear it bouncing around one side of our camp and then the other. We were scared to death, and I was beginning to regret that we had tried to make our own camp. Then the worst. The voice began singing within like 10 feet of where we were standing. Whatever was singing should have been close beside me, but I turned my light and there was nothing there. That was about the time we decided to give up and run. We left everything behind, our tent, our camping gear, and just ran to the main campgrounds, which was luckily not that far. As we ran, the singing got further and further away, but continued, almost getting obnoxious. It was like whatever it was knew we were running. We got back to camp and rolled right into our main tents. My wife was worried about going back the next day to get our sleeping bags and other gear, but I assured her we were finally safe and collecting our things wouldn't be an issue. That was until we went the next day and found all of our things were gone. Not a trace of us was left, like something cleaned up after us. But it was too early for the parks people to have come through and clean anything up. After that, we had no choice but to leave and spend the rest of our week together at home. We were without supplies in a desert, so that was really our only option. Whatever it was, I will say we were scared, but we didn't feel threatened. I felt like this thing was watching us, but it was just curious about us. I would be interested in going back to camp in the same area, but I would take some precautions. You never know what or why that thing was singing. There's a lot of strange people and things out there. I was working as a ranger in Grand Teton National Park some years back. It was a fairly easy park to get around if you were an outdoorsman, and I was very knowledgeable about all the trails and peaks in that park. I did a lot of patrols in the touristy areas around Jackson Lake, but occasionally one or two of us would have to hike the back trails to check on others and make sure everything was okay. It was an early fall day and the park wasn't too packed, and I figured a hike would keep me from getting bored, so I volunteered. We allowed permits for the backcountry camping, so I wanted to check on the areas that I knew would be in use, and let the people know that the rangers are out there for them. I was up for a little adventure, so I grabbed my pack and headed out. I came to a trail that went off into a more remote area with a lot of tall pines. The further I went, though, I felt like I was being watched. I would stop and listen, but I couldn't hear anything out of the ordinary, so I just kept on going. Eventually, I came to this little stream, and I decided to stop for a drink and get a little something to eat. I realized I hadn't run into any campsites, and I had gone a lot further than I thought. In fact, as I started to eat, I noticed that I have never seen this stream before. I know it seems impossible to cover a whole park, and it is, but when you have the same routine of going into certain areas constantly, you don't get turned around so easily. I decided to take a break and just enjoy the scenery. I was leaning against a tree when I noticed some moving in the brush across from me. It looked like a deer or an elk, but it didn't seem right. The animal seemed too big for one thing, and it moved with this unnatural grace that kind of made me uneasy. I watched as this animal poked its head out of the brush and sniffed around for a moment before deciding to come out into the open. It was huge, easily bigger than any bear I'd ever seen, though not as quite as some of the grizzlies we have up here. I've seen those in person too. This thing had long reddish-brown fur that hung down past its waist and large pointed ears that stuck straight up from its head. Its eyes were this bright yellowish orange color, and they seemed to glow slightly in the sunlight filtering through the trees. It sniffed at the ground and then stood on two legs, which allowed it to be even taller than me, and I'm 6'2". It was about 20 yards away from me. I slowly reached for my gun, which was strapped to the side of my pack. It must have seen the movement because it suddenly turned and bolted into the brush. I sat there in shock at what I had just seen. What on earth could that be? Was it some kind of bear? A big one, but still a bear? I decided to head back out of those woods and report what had happened. When I got back to the ranger station, I told the story to the other rangers. They thought I was messing with them, but when they realized I was serious, they were as shocked as I had been. No one could explain what it was, and we decided not to tell any of the visitors about it, for fear of panic or some idiot going out there looking for the thing. We continued to keep an eye on that area, though, and never saw anything else like it again, at least while I worked there. Death Valley has some of the best hiking trails and breathtaking views of desert life in the country. I love going there when I'm in California. I've never seen huge rock formations jutting out of the sand in one area and then fields and fields of wildflowers in another. It's a one of a kind, but of course it has its folklore. I try to ignore negative things, but then when I was visiting Death Valley last year, something happened that changed my mind. I had been hiking through a more arid area of the park. It was June, so I made sure I had plenty of sunscreen and water. I found a small clearing with huge boulders surrounded by rocky mountain formations that had several cliffs all around them. I thought it would be a good time to sit down and reapply some sunscreen and drink some water. I needed to relax for a bit. After having about 5 minutes of peace, my stomach suddenly felt like it was turning. There were eyes on me and I knew it. I looked up from what I was doing and didn't see anyone coming along the trail in either direction. I looked all around me, but there wasn't even a small animal or insect nearby. I was going to shrug it off and get ready to move on when I noticed in the corner of my eye that something high above me was moving. I looked up and saw what appeared to be the top of a head, and then it ducked back down out of sight. I started to wonder if someone was hiding in the rocks above me. Then something moved on the other side, and I thought I saw another top of a head. I was being watched by several people, but I had no idea what they were doing. I sat there for another minute or two trying to figure out what was going on. I wasn't sure if they knew that I had noticed them or not, so I just tried to play it cool. I slowly started to move, staying focused on my pack, putting one thing away at a time. I got up from the boulder I was on and I looked around in a sly way not to catch anyone's gaze. There was another head that popped up as soon as I did, and I couldn't help but flinch, which pretty much gave it away that I knew they were there. That's when I heard the echo of footsteps and laughter from above me, and it looked like people were disappearing around the rock trying to get down. I had no idea if they were coming for me, so I started to run down the trail. I looked back and saw nothing, so I continued down the trail. That's when I heard them. There were multiple people saying, "Don't leave," and "Come with us." I turned to my side as now I'm running down the trail and I saw one of them. It was some type of feral human. It looked crazed and had horrible skin and teeth, and patches of hair on its head. I ran as fast as I could back to my car, and I never went hiking there again. It's a shame because I really liked that place. I was hiking through the Carlsbad Caverns National Park in New Mexico. I wanted to get a look at as many caverns as I could in one day, as I was just passing through New Mexico on my way back home to California. When I arrived, I realized I needed a ton of permits if I was going to see everything I wanted to see. So I just purchased one for the closest cavern in and began to search on my own from there. Sure, I was breaking some rules, but I had already been traveling and didn't really have the money. I considered myself an avid hiker, so I wasn't too worried. I found a trail that led to a small cavern and started down it. This particular cavern wasn't even marked as a major attraction on my map. After this, I wanted to see if I could find any more caverns that weren't on the map, but I figured I would just start with the one in front of me. It was a narrow opening, and inside it was pitch black. I could tell it was small but deep. At the entrance to the cave, I began second-guessing myself. I stopped and looked up and down at the narrow slit in the rock. It was about 20 feet into the air, and the rocks overlapped all the way down until about my height, and then they opened up a bit. Even standing where I was, I couldn't see anything inside. I decided to start in a little, and I shined my flashlight around. The cavern was still pitch black beyond my flashlight. I continued farther into the cave until I realized this was becoming more of a tunnel. I was getting squeezed a bit as I went forward. There was a narrow part where I had to completely exhale and relax to squeeze through. Right after I made it through is when I heard this faint sound coming from deep inside the cavern. It sounded like a person moaning or groaning, but it was very faint and barely audible. I shouted, "Hello!" thinking that someone might be in the cave ahead of me. Then the moaning got louder and louder, and I could make out what they were saying. I heard it as clear as day in this very sinister voice. It said, "Death is near." So now I'm completely freaked out, and I turn around to exit the cave, but I'm so panicked that I can't relax enough and exhale to squeeze past through this part of the cave to get out. I could start to hear footsteps as if someone was trudging through some water in the cave. So I exhaled as hard as I could, and I pulled myself through that opening as I was scraping the hell out of my back and my chest. I could now see the exit to the cavern, and I started running towards it. As I got out into the fresh air, someone else arrived and was going to go into the cave. I told him, "I think there is someone in there. Do not go in there. It sounds like something evil." They did take my advice and didn't go in. After that debacle, I don't go caving anymore. In fact, now I'm a little claustrophobic. I always wanted to go backpacking through the Redwood National Park, and I was finally able to do it back in the spring of 2006. I had the weekend to myself. My girlfriend at the time had plans, and I was finally going to get first-hand glimpse of those giant trees. I drove from my home in LA all the way up there, secured my motel, and headed to the park. Just walking into the park was amazing. I never knew just how big those trees were, no matter how many times you see it in movies or magazines. I was so stunned by the width, let alone the height. I grabbed a map and was on my way, so excited just to be out there. I had passed a few other hikers along the trails. I had some conversations, and I even stopped to eat with one couple because we had picked the same spot to stop at. I had seen some smaller forest creatures, and I swatted a few bugs, but there hadn't been any of the elk or bears I had heard about, not even a bobcat. I decided to go off trail a bit and just run parallel with it to see if I could catch a glimpse of something in the wild. The trail was clear to me at first, but as I descended down some hilly areas, I didn't realize I was losing it. Before I knew it, I was no longer parallel, and I was trying to look at the map and figure out where I got to in a straight line. It was in the middle of nowhere on the map. The trees were becoming more overwhelming the more I looked up. I was extremely nervous because everything was looking the same, and I didn't want to lose sight of the direction I came in. I couldn't help it though. Then it happened. Finally, an elk stepped out and walked by me. I stayed perfectly still and tried to calm down, taking the animal as a sign that everything was fine. But then it bolted. So did everything else. I heard birds flapping away and other things scurrying along the forest floor. Something had come into the area and scared everything off. I thought perhaps it was a bear, but something inside me said it wasn't. I looked around first at ground level and couldn't make heads or tails of anything coming from any direction. But then I heard something above me. I didn't want to look up, knowing that I would probably lose my lunch. But it was there, staring down at me. Its claws held onto the tree beside me about 30 feet into the air. It reminded me of a dog, but it had to be about 7 or 8 feet tall. Its body was massive. Its chest and hips had hair, but it looked like the back was covered in scales or possibly even a bone sticking out. Its front legs looked like a dog's too, the way they were dug into the tree. But its hind legs were much more human looking, and in a squatting position to allow its giant clawed feet to sink into the bark. It was its face that really had me frozen. It was more human looking than not. The eyes were blood red and piercing, and it was showing its teeth. It was almost like this thing was trying to warn me, like it was going to be hunting here and I needed to go. I was questioning whether I should run or walk, or if I should just trust that this thing wasn't just waiting for me to turn around. Then it let out this roar that sounded like it had 2 voices, one deeper than the other. I just bolted in the direction I came. After about 20 minutes of heading in the same direction, I luckily picked up on the trail again. It took me a good hour to get back to my car. I couldn't believe what I saw in there. Is this even possible? Was I delirious from being lost? I don't know, but it was terrifying. I had this very odd experience when I was working at Teton National Park. We had this jet black dog that would be seen roaming the park. It wasn't a wolf and it was too big to be a coyote. It almost looked like a cross between the two. I guess it would best be described as an all-black large German shepherd. Anyway, I was working at the Jackson Lake Lodge during the summer of 2003. At night, when all the guests had gone to bed and it was just me and my coworker cleaning up for the next day, we went outside to smoke a cigarette, and we saw that same black dog that we've seen at least a dozen times before. We watched it for a few minutes as it sniffed around the trash bins, and then it moved along. Never thought anything about it other than the fact that we've seen this stray dog roaming around for quite some time now. I knew it wasn't anyone's pet because I've seen this at least for the last year while I was working there. Anyways, fast forward a few weeks, the same coworker and I are catching a smoke late night again. And we see this same dog limping really badly, and it goes into this set of bushes outside the lodge. It looked really hurt, and it was about 30 or 40 yards away, and my coworker and I cautiously go over to where we saw it go into the bushes, and we call out to it saying, "Hey buddy, are you okay?" I could hear it whimpering from about 20 yards away. Then as we finally come up to the bushes, there's this naked Native American man lying there in the bushes, and his leg is bleeding profusely. We were both shocked. We asked him if he's okay and what had happened to him. But he just looked at us and he said something that we couldn't understand. I don't think he spoke English. I called 911 for help because we didn't know what to do. I signaled to him in some makeshift sign language for him to just stay there because we're going to go inside and get a blanket and something to help stop the bleeding. My coworker and I run back to the lodge and get a first aid kit and a blanket. And when we come back out, we see that same black dog limping really badly, running across the Lake Lodge property. I was so confused on what was going on. When the ambulance showed up, we told him where the man was, but he was nowhere to be found. It was the craziest thing. I became very troubled after all of this, and I started doing a lot of research online to find out if there's any explanation for what had happened. The only thing that logically makes any sense is that this was a skinwalker or some type of shapeshifter that we encountered that night. This happened in 2006 when I was a ranger for the U.S. Forest Service in the Mount Hood National Forest in Oregon. I was on patrol and driving down a dirt road. As I drove down the road, I heard this loud moaning and wailing sound to my right. It sounded like something huge was in pain and calling for help. At first, I thought it might be someone in distress, so I turned off the truck and I listened more carefully. When nothing else happened, I decided that if someone was hurt, They probably would have called for help by now, and it must be an animal of some kind. So, since there was no other sounds for after about 5 minutes, I started up my truck and continued on my patrol. As soon as I got to the next intersection of roads, where there was another ranger station about a half-mile away, another call came from the same direction as before. This time it sounded like someone trying to imitate a human scream for help, but it wasn't quite doing it right. Then another call came from farther away in the forest, and this one definitely sounded like an animal in pain or distress. Whatever made that sound had to be massive because its voice carried so far through the forest with such volume. I decided to drive to the other ranger station to see if they heard it too. When I got there, I asked my coworker if he heard anything. He said that he's been inside the whole time, but his dog out back was whining and acting scared. We both went out back to check on his dog, and that's when we both heard it again. A call came from the same direction as I heard it before, and we both listened as it echoed through the forest. It definitely sounded like something huge. After that last call, nothing else happened for about 10 minutes. So I decided to drive in that area looking for whatever made those calls. As soon as I got back to that same dirt road where I originally heard the calls, a few hundred yards down the road, I see this large black figure standing next to the tree line just off the road. I stopped my truck and I watched it for several minutes as it stood there motionless. It was too far away that I couldn't tell if it was standing on 2 legs or 4, but its silhouette against the trees looked very unusual. I decided to drive a little bit closer since I had my pistol with me and my shotgun in the back of the truck. As I got within about 50 yards, it suddenly turned around and began walking away from me into the forest. It walked like a human walks. Its arms swung back and forth as it walked. When it got to an area where there were small trees about 6 or 8 feet tall, it pushed them down as if they were weeds and just kept walking through them. At this point, I decided whatever it wasn't anything good. So after watching this thing walk through these small trees without even slowing down, I drove off in another direction hoping to get a better look at exactly what I had seen. But after driving around for about 20 minutes, I never saw anything else. And no more calls came either. I don't know for sure what that was, but if there is such a thing as a Sasquatch, I believe that was one of them. The power this thing had when it was making those yells, and how it just trampled through small trees was incredible. My job as a ranger is to help visitors at the park, and for the most part people are very nice and act very normal. However, sometimes there are real weirdos that we have to deal with. Just last week I had a younger couple come to me that they were being followed on one of the trails by some man who appeared to be homeless. He would get really close behind them and start saying things like, "I just want to talk to you." They said they wanted to be left alone, but this man was really persistent. He was also asking where the couple was camping, and if he could join them later for some s'mores by the campfire. He wasn't being physically aggressive, just more of a weird annoyance. I ended up finding the man and told him to leave the couple alone and let them enjoy the park. He seemed to get it, then he apologized to me for causing any issues. Well, later that night, he had followed this couple to their campsite and just shows up at their campfire and sits down and starts asking them a bunch of questions. He also asked if he could come back later to their tent and sleep with them. I was called again by the couple, and this time more upset at what this guy was doing. So I went up there to find him still hanging around their campsite, even after being told numerous times to leave them alone. He didn't want to leave the area, so I had to physically get him into my truck and take him back to my office. Our station is a little log cabin that sits just off one of the main trails. As soon as we got inside, I told him that he had to leave the park and not come back. He started asking me why. I just read him a few of our rules that visitors have to follow while in the park, which includes no aggressive behavior or harassment of other guests. He still didn't get it, so I escorted him out of my office and told him he was now trespassing on federal property. He left, but as he did, he said something like, "I'll be back tonight, just wait." Well, luckily for us, his words were empty threats and he never returned again that night or since. Weirdos like this are usually harmless, but sometimes they can be dangerous if not dealt with. I try to be as nice as possible when dealing with these people, but sometimes they just need a good hard lesson. If anyone has any issues like this while visiting the park, don't hesitate to come get a ranger. We'll do what we can to help you out and make sure you have a safe and enjoyable visit at the park. Don't let one bad apple ruin your experience, because for the most part, most people are very friendly and nice. I'm not a ranger, but my brother is, and he told me this story of how he saw something that absolutely terrified him. He was in the backcountry of Yellowstone National Park, and he was hiking with his dog to a cabin that was about 5 miles out. So he was carrying all of his gear, and it took them about 3 hours to get there. Once they got there, the dog remained outside, and he went inside to start a fire. His dog was just outside sniffing around. It was just starting to get dark, so he turned on his headlamp to light up what he was doing. After about 20 minutes of working on the fire, his dog started growling outside. He looked over where the dog was at and saw something standing behind a tree, maybe 40 or 50 yards away. He didn't know what it was, so he shined his light on it, but as soon as he did, the thing ran off, and he could hear it running through the forest. He was concerned that it might be a bear or a wolf, so he grabbed his dog and went inside the cabin. About an hour and a half later, it was pitch black outside, and his dog, who was usually a very calm dog, started growling again, but this time whimpering at the same time. He looked out his window, and about 30 yards away, he saw these two glowing orange eyes that were standing at least 6 to 7 feet off the ground. His first thought that it was a grizzly bear, but the eyes looked really different to him, something that he's never seen before. He stood there for a minute or two, then he grabbed his high-powered flashlight and aimed it in the direction of where this supposed bear was. What he saw, I still don't know if he's telling the truth, because it sounds like something right out of a Hollywood movie. About 30 yards away is this gigantic werewolf creature with a huge dog head, standing upright, and it's black as night. He said the eyes looked so weird when he hit him with the flashlight. This thing was pacing back and forth on its hind legs, then hunching over onto all fours. He instantly knew that this wasn't right, and he felt like he was in danger. At the time, he said his dog was whimpering and making all these weird noises that he's never heard before. He reached for his shotgun and opened the door a crack. And as soon as he did, this thing comes bolting towards the door. And as soon as he sticks his shotgun out of the door, it instantly changes directions and heads off in a 90-degree direction off to the right. My brother, now completely confused and panicked, stayed in the cabin that night and didn't sleep much. He ended up cutting his trip short and hiking back the next day with his shotgun in hand the entire time. I worked in search and rescue, and one time we got a call for a missing girl in her 20s. She was camping with her boyfriend at the time, and he returned to the car for something, and when he came back, she was gone. We got the call about 2 hours after she went missing. There were no signs of her leaving. All of her clothes, her backpack, and even her cell phone was still in the tent. We started searching and found nothing. After about 2 hours of searching, we were getting ready to call it off for the night when we heard some sort of strange noise come from a distance. It was nothing like I've ever heard before. It sounded like a mix between a human scream, a coyote howl, and the sound you hear in old horror movies when something is chasing you and you're running for your life. We couldn't figure out what it was, but we all agreed that whatever it wasn't natural. We called in more search teams as well as the helicopter with thermal imaging cameras since it was dark by this time. The helicopter arrived within 20 minutes and they scanned the area with the cameras, but they didn't see anything. This strange noise was heard again, and this time it was coming from a thick patch of trees near an old abandoned camp about a mile away. We decided to investigate, and as we approached the tree line, I could smell something really foul. It was like nothing I've ever smelled before. It was almost like something rotten mixed with dog poop and ammonia. Whatever it was must have noticed us, because all of a sudden it started running away from us, and we could hear it crashing through the forest as it tried to get away. We searched for that girl for 2 weeks and never found a trace of anything. I later found out that there was another missing person a year before that in the same area. They never found him either. I don't know what it is, but I'm convinced it had something to do with this girl's disappearance and that thing that was making all of those noises in the woods. The craziest thing is that there were no signs or tracks of the missing girl anywhere. It's like someone just picked her up and took her. This took place in the summer of 2019. I was working in the Allegheny National Forest and I was on patrol towards the end of my shift. I was headed back to our station to wrap things up before I left for the night. I was driving about 35 miles an hour or so on one of our main roads when all of a sudden this deer comes out of nowhere and runs right onto the road. It was coming from my right side and it jetted out so fast that I hit it with my left front headlight. The deer spun around and fell, then got back up and started limping off into the woods. I could tell that it was okay by the way it was running. I got out of my vehicle and checked my front headlight to see what damage was done. The light was smashed, but other than that, there was very little damage. That's when I looked off to my right because I heard something coming through the woods, the same area where this deer ran out from. I heard the sound of branches moving and twigs snapping on the ground. I thought it might be a black bear because we've seen a lot of those lately in this area of the forest. I went into my vehicle and I grabbed my spotlight and I shined it in the direction where I thought the bear was coming from. That's when I saw something that I'll never forget. It wasn't a black bear, however, it was black and about 3 times the size of the biggest black bear that I had ever seen. No wonder this deer came out of nowhere. It was probably running for its life. Staring back at me was this massive creature who stood taller than me. It had these small black eyes and this big head sitting on an oversized pair of shoulders. I heard a car coming from behind me, and this thing turned its head and shoulders all at the same time to look at it. It was a fellow ranger of mine who had been out on patrol. As the other ranger pulls up, I shine the flashlight at this thing in the woods and yelled at him to look at it. That's when it turned around and headed back into the woods. The other ranger got out of his vehicle and he could see it turn away and heard it take off into the woods. We both stood there for quite some time trying to figure out what this thing was. I was supposed to be done with my shift at the time. However, I stayed a few more hours talking to my coworker on what we just saw. At approximately 2:30 p.m., I was dispatched to a possible assault incident. Upon my arrival, the victim and her daughter were standing outside their residence. After speaking with them, I learned that while the mother and daughter were on a walk, a strange man grabbed this woman's daughter and was trying to pull her away from the mother. The mother, who always carries pepper spray, sprayed him and then they ran back home. The mother and daughter were sitting on their porch watching this man. The mother had a shotgun in hand. The man just stood there on the street staring at them on the porch until I arrived. When he heard me arrive, he ran across a field and started walking down Highway 70. I got into my patrol car and drove in the direction of Highway 70. As I approached a curve in the road about a quarter mile from where I initially met the victims, I saw a male subject walking on the east side of the road. He was wearing dark clothes and had his head down, looking at something he held in his hands as he walked. He matched the description of the man that assaulted this woman's daughter. I pulled my patrol car onto the shoulder of the roadway and turned on my emergency lights. When he noticed me approaching him from behind, he stopped walking and turned to face me as I pulled up alongside him, about 10 feet away. He kept his hands hidden inside his jacket pockets as he stood there staring at me through his dark sunglasses. His hair was also long enough to cover part of his ears. I got out of my patrol car and told him to turn around with his hands behind his head. He didn't respond and continued to stare at me through his dark sunglasses. I then noticed he had a small scar under his right eye, which ran from his eye down to his cheek and towards his chin. I asked him again to turn around, and that's when he took his sunglasses off and started speaking in what sounded like Latin. I was so startled by his speaking in Latin that I quickly reached for my weapon, which was holstered on my right hip. As soon as I started to reach for it, he took off running into the woods. I followed him into the woods, and about 30 yards in, I see this small pile of rocks on the ground next to a tree. There were markings on some of the rocks which appeared to be symbols or letters. I also noticed that this man had a backpack with him. He had dropped his backpack when he took off running. He ran so fast that he completely disappeared into the woods. I spent 30 minutes trying to track him down, but I couldn't. I returned to where he dropped his backpack and looked inside to find what was in it. In his backpack was a white robe, 30 feet of rope twine, 3 knives, and a copy of the Satanic Bible. This was by far the strangest call I've been on. I've never heard about this man again after that. We sent a patrol car to check on the woman's residence a few times a day for 3 weeks after the incident. I'm a former police officer, and I had several strange experiences in my life, but the strangest by far was when I went camping with my family. I was on a camping trip with my family at a campground in New York State. It's located in the Adirondack Mountains near Lake Harris. The campground is located in a valley. Surrounding the valley are rolling mountains. There's only one way into the valley and one way out. The campground itself consists of 2 parts, an upper part and a lower part. The upper part has cabins that can be rented out for the summer and some campsites with RV hookups. The lower part is strictly tent camping only. No RVs are allowed there. It's also very secluded with a lot of trees to block your view of other campsites or the road leading in and out of the campground. We were there for 3 days during the summer of 2018. On one of those nights, around 1 a.m. on July 25th, I woke up to use the bathroom. As soon as I opened the tent door, I could hear something sniffing and breathing heavily right outside of our tent. It sounded like it was just inches away from me, so naturally I froze out of fear and curiosity as to what it could be. After about 10 seconds or so, it moved off into the woods and all went quiet again. After a few minutes had passed, my wife woke up and asked me what was going on. I told her that I woke up to use the restroom, and that's when I heard this breathing of an animal really close by. The next morning when we woke up, we found several footprints in the dirt that were very strange looking. They were long like a dog or wolves, but they had 5 toes instead of 4 like normal canines do. The prints also showed whatever made them was much heavier than any normal animal would be. Whatever left those tracks weighed at least 300 pounds, if not more. I've seen all kinds of animal tracks in my life as a police officer, and these were by far one of the strangest that I've ever seen. I've also spent countless nights camping throughout my life, and have never once encountered anything strange like this before, or since either. After seeing these tracks, I became even more convinced that what we heard was some kind of strange creature rather than an actual dog or a wolf. I was working the midnight shift and had just finished my nightly patrol of our local cemetery. As I was driving, dispatch called out a break-in at a residence on Maple Street. The reporting party stated that she could hear someone walking around her house but couldn't see anyone. She did say it sounded like they were inside of her house, though. We sent one car to the scene, and I headed over myself to assist. When I arrived at the scene, our officer was standing outside his car with his spotlight, scanning the area around the house. It was a small 2-story house with a large porch that wrapped around the front and one side of the house. The porch had white columns on each corner and had a large swing in the middle of it. He told me that he had been inside checking things out when he heard what sounded like someone walking downstairs right behind him. When he turned to look, though, it was as if whoever it was had simply vanished without a trace. He said he checked everywhere but couldn't find anything or anyone who could have made those sounds. After about 20 minutes of searching ourselves with no results, we decided to call it a night. About 2 hours later, though, we received another call from this same residence reporting yet another break-in attempt by someone trying to pry open a window. Once again, our officer could find no one around the house, and everything appeared to be locked up tight, except for an upstairs window that had been opened. The owner of the residence claimed she heard it open, and she wasn't the one opening it. We went upstairs to take a look at the open window, and we closed it. And just as we did that, a large rock came flying through the window. It missed our officer by inches. I looked outside in the backyard, and there's no way that rock could have been thrown by anybody. She had a fenced-in backyard, and there was no one out there. It was a large fenced-in yard with really nothing in it, no trees or anything. The back of the house faced the cemetery I patrolled earlier that night. So there's no way anyone could have thrown that rock without us seeing them. We asked the owner if she had anyone she could stay with for the night, and she said her sister lived a few blocks away. We advised her to go stay with her sister for the night, and we would watch over things until daylight. The officer and I stood out the front of the house until about 4 a.m. when we decided to call it a night. The next day, we had several officers come out to assist us in searching the area for any clues or evidence of what had happened. We found nothing, though, except for the rock which had been thrown through the window. It was about 4 inches in diameter and weighed at least a pound, if not more. I never believed in ghosts or spirits until I was on that call. I can tell you that they are real. This happened in 2014. I was on patrol on Highway 99 in the middle of the night. It was about 2:30 a.m. and I had been driving for several hours and was getting tired. I decided to pull over at a rest stop just off the highway so that I could get some coffee and wake up before continuing my patrol. There were no other cars there except for mine, so I went inside the building to get my coffee. It was a small 1-story building with a bathroom in the back and an area to sit and have coffee or eat at the front. I went inside and there was nobody there. I got my coffee and came back out to the car. I was sitting there and started to drink my coffee when behind the rest stop building I hear some strange noise. It was a cross between a howl and a moan. I thought it was weird, but I didn't think much of it. Then about 5 minutes later, I hear the same noise again, only louder. At that point, I got out of my car to see what was going on. I walked behind the building and I saw nothing. Then I heard the noise again. This time it was coming from across the highway. It was a small highway with only 2 lanes, no divider, and sparse traffic. There were trees on both sides of the highway about 75 yards apart. I heard the noise again, and it was coming from the tree line on my side of the highway. At this point, I really couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to keep moving, or maybe there was a weird echo in that area. I walked over to where I could see into the trees and basically saw nothing. There was a small clearing there, and I could hear some moving around in the brush. It sounded like 2 animals fighting, but I really couldn't see anything. Then, all of a sudden, whatever it was came running out of the brush and right across the highway where I could get a good look at it. What I saw was huge, bigger than any bear that you've ever seen. It had long black hair and it was matted and stringy looking. It had a strange gait, kind of like a horse, but not quite. When it got to the highway, it stopped and looked at me for several seconds before turning and running back into the brush on the other side of the highway. I'm not sure what this thing was, but it looked like a cross between a bear and a big dog. We monitored that area for the next 3 weeks for any strange activity. We received 3 calls from residents in that area about a strange animal that was walking around on their property. We never found anything, and the calls stopped after that 3 weeks. I don't know what this thing was, but it wasn't normal. It wasn't a bear because they don't have that type of gait. And it wasn't any kind of known big cat because it was just too big to be a mountain lion or any other known cat in North America. I had this one call in 2006 where I was called to check on a large animal at a residence. The call came in as an unknown animal, and the person reporting it said it looked like a werewolf. We get all kinds of calls. You can't imagine the things that we have to respond to. It was around 10 p.m. when I got this call, and I decided to head over to check it out. When I arrived, the couple was out on their front porch, and the wife was holding a large flashlight. The husband said he had been watching this strange thing for about 10 minutes, and it was still out there in their yard. I asked him to describe what he saw, and he said it looked like a werewolf. He said it had grayish-brown hair and pointed ears. I thought to myself, are you kidding me? But he seemed very serious about what he was saying, so I asked him if he wanted to go out there and check it out with me, but he declined and stayed on the porch. I got my spotlight and drew my weapon because I didn't know what I was going to run into. But I know it's not what this guy said. I walked around to the back of the house. It was a ranch-style house, and the yard was enclosed by a wood fence about 6 feet tall, and there was a gate at the driveway entrance. There were trees to the north of the home and an open field to the south that ran for several hundred yards before it reached some more homes. I walked around to the back of the house and didn't see anything at first, but then caught movement in my light beam where the tree line met the fence. I saw what appeared to be a large creature jump over this 6-foot fence and into the woods in a single bound. I didn't get a look at the front of this thing, I just saw the back of it for a split second. But it was enough for me to know that something like this isn't native to the area. I've never seen anything that large leap over a 6-foot fence like that. I decided to call in for backup because we needed a few more officers out here to scan the area for this thing. We started checking the area with flashlights and dogs, but we never found anything. We searched until midnight that night, and I was off the next day, so I went back out there to check on things. I spoke to the couple, and they said they didn't see anything after we arrived. This thing must have been passing through because that was the last that we ever heard of it. We still talk about it at the station and refer to it as the Wolf Man. This story takes place in upstate New York in the town of Lewis. The officer on duty is responding to a domestic disturbance call when he and his fellow officer caught something they had never encountered before on camera. On March 16, 2011, I was working as a state trooper in upstate New York. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I received a call from dispatch about a domestic disturbance and an address on Route 10 in the town of Lewis. I headed out to the location and arrived there in about 15 minutes from the call. When I pulled up to the residence, there were 2 other police cars already there with their lights still flashing. I parked my patrol car behind one of them and got out. As soon as I did, another officer approached me and said that he needed some help with something strange that had happened at this location. He told me that he didn't know what it was, but it wasn't anything he had ever seen before. He asked if I would come over and take a look at something on his video camera while he explained what had happened. I agreed, and we walked over to his patrol car where he showed me footage from his dash cam. The timestamp on the video read 10:23 p.m. when it started recording. The first thing you see is him pulling up into the driveway of this residence after being dispatched to respond to this call for help. As he pulls up, you can see a large dark figure standing in the driveway in front of the patrol car. The driveway is about 100 yards long and has a slight incline at the end. The area where this creature was standing was very dark due to the lack of lighting in that area. The only light came from his patrol car's headlights. As he pulls up, you can see this large dark figure standing right in front of his car. It appears to be around 7 feet tall with long hair all over its body. It slowly walks towards the vehicle as if it were walking downhill and not on a flat surface. This area of the driveway was pretty flat. It's only moving its legs and not its arms. It was walking in a very odd way. Then it goes down onto all fours and runs past the right side of the patrol car, taking off into the woods. The face was kind of blurry, so we had to play back the footage several times, but you could make out that it had a snout. After watching the video, I asked him if anyone else had seen this footage yet, and he told me no one had except for another officer who arrived at the scene shortly after him. He said the officer was so shocked by what he saw that he was speechless for a few minutes. I took out my cell phone and recorded the footage from the dash cam. I later downloaded it to my computer and have kept a copy ever since. After looking at this footage, we begin scanning the property with a spotlight to see if we can see this thing. The homeowners originally complained about these loud crying sounds outside of their home, and their trash cans were spilled all over the place. We spent an hour at the residence scanning the property, but this thing was gone or hiding in the woods waiting for us to leave. The officer I was with that night is a very experienced police officer. He has been working on the force for over 20 years and has never seen anything like this before. I've seen a lot of strange things in 10 years as an officer, but this takes the cake. I don't know what this thing is, but it isn't human. It's not a dog or any other type of animal that I've ever seen before. This next story takes place in New Mexico, when a state trooper witnesses something out of the ordinary and is shocked at what he finds. I was working as a state trooper in the summer of 2008. I was working alone on a midnight shift, patrolling a small town about an hour from our station. I was driving around town when I saw what looked like a man and a woman arguing in front of an apartment complex. The woman was yelling at the man who just stood there and appeared to be ignoring her. She then slapped him across the face and he still didn't do anything. As I drove past them, my headlights caught them for a moment, and I could see that she had long blonde hair and was wearing a white dress or a nightgown. The man had dark hair with glasses on and appeared to be wearing jeans and a shirt. They both appeared to be in their mid-20s or so. About 5 minutes later, I noticed that they were walking down the street towards me. So I turned off my lights to avoid blinding them as they walked by my patrol car, which was parked along the side of the road. As they got closer, I realized that the man was carrying a large black sack. He appeared to be struggling with it as they walked past my car. I stepped out of my patrol car, approaching them to ask them if everything was all right. The man immediately dropped the bag and started yelling at me that he didn't do anything wrong, and that he had every right to carry whatever he wanted, wherever he wanted. The woman just stood there crying hysterically with her hands over her face. The man continued yelling at me, so I told him that I needed him to step over to my patrol car. He complied, but he kept screaming about his rights as an American citizen and how he wasn't doing anything wrong. At that point, it was very obvious that there was something or someone in that bag. I opened up the back of my patrol car and I told him that I was going to place him in the back of my car until he calmed down. I closed the door to my patrol car and walked over to the black sack which had fallen on the sidewalk where he dropped it. The woman was still standing there crying, but she didn't move as I approached her with my flashlight shining on the bag. When I got close enough, I could see that there appeared to be a body inside of it, because a shoe was sticking out. When I shined my light into the bag, I saw that it was a cut-up body wrapped in plastic. I immediately had the woman placed into the back of the car and called for backup. We eventually found out that this was a drug deal gone bad, and the man who I eventually arrested shot and killed one of his customers for hitting on his girlfriend. This happened in 2008 in a small town in Vermont, when an officer encounters the strangest thing he's ever dealt with while on the job. I was an officer for a small town in Vermont. I was working the midnight shift, and it was about 2 a.m. when I got a call from dispatch to go to a local restaurant that had been broken into. The dispatcher said that the owner of the restaurant had reported seeing someone inside the building and wanted us to check it out. We were about 5 minutes away, so I told dispatch we would be there shortly. My partner and I pulled up in front of the restaurant and walked around back where we found an open door. We could see that the lights were on inside. It turned out that all of the doors were locked except for the back door, so whoever broke in must have just walked right in through the back door. As we checked around inside, we noticed it was very messy, like someone had been trying to look for something, possibly trying to find a safe. Then, as we were checking behind some shelves near an office area, I heard some noise coming from outside by the front door. I went to check it out, and I saw two people walking down the street towards us. They stopped when they saw me standing there with my flashlight and badge. They asked if everything was okay at this place because they had seen lights flashing inside when they walked by about 30 minutes ago. I told them that we have just arrived on the scene, and I asked if they had seen anyone inside, but they said no. They didn't come close to the building because it looked creepy to them with all of the lights flashing. That's when I heard my partner yell. I turned around to go back inside, and he was standing in the doorway leading to an office area. He said that he had found something and I should come check it out. I went into the office, and he was shining his flashlight on the wall. There were scratches all over the wall, and someone had written "Help me" in what looked like blood. I told him that we needed to get out of there and call for backup. We went back out through the back door and around the other side of the building to get back to our patrol car. As we walked around on the other side, I noticed that there were no lights on inside anymore. That's really odd because they were just on 30 seconds ago. Then my partner yelled, "Look," pointing at a window about 6 feet off of the ground. There were scratches all over the window, and someone had written "Help me" in blood on the glass. The same thing as inside. I took a picture of it with my phone. Both of us were completely freaked out, and we went and sat in our vehicle while we waited for backup. About 15 minutes later, 2 other officers arrived. I told them what we had found, and we went inside to check it out. We walked around the building the way we came out and pointed out the window to them, but it was gone. No scratches or blood on the window. That's when I got completely freaked out because I pulled up my phone and showed them both the picture of the scratches and how it said "Help me," which appeared to be written in blood. We were all so confused at this point. We go inside and the same thing. Nothing is there. No writing on the wall or anything. The place still looks disheveled though. We were all there for 30 minutes before we had to leave the site. There was nothing for us to do. It was the creepiest thing that I've ever encountered on the job. This happened near Shasta Lake in California, when an officer on patrol witnessed something he's never seen before. This occurred in the summer of 2011. I was a police officer in Redding, California. I was on patrol by myself one night and had just finished taking a report of a minor traffic accident. It was about 2 a.m. when I left the area of the accident. I was traveling westbound on Highway 299 towards Redding. As I approached a turnoff, my headlights caught an object moving across the road in front of me. My first thought was that it must be a person crossing the highway at that location. As my patrol car neared the spot where this thing had crossed, it had suddenly appeared on the roadway directly in front of me, about 75 feet away. It had covered quite a distance in a very little time. It had stood there for a few seconds, then dashed off into some heavy brush to my right along the edge of the highway. The creature was massive, and its stride as it ran in front of me was incredibly long and fluid. I immediately stopped my patrol car to better see this creature through the brush. It was at this time I realized that what I had just seen was not a person. It had been much too large and had this odd shape to its body. It looks like it stood about 6 or 7 feet tall with a very muscular build. The legs were very long in proportion to its body, and the arms were also long but not proportioned to its leg length. It had a large boxy head with no discernible neck, and the hair on this creature was dark brownish black in color. The creature moved through the underbrush for about 30 seconds when suddenly there was a flash of light from inside its location. The light appeared to come from some kind of electronic device, as it emitted a bright white-yellow glow that seemed to soften in an orange glow as it faded away completely after about 5 seconds or so. I sat there for several minutes waiting for this creature to reappear, but it never did. I then returned to my patrol car, driving along the edge of the highway to try and find this thing. I couldn't find anything. I have seen bears in the wild before while I was working as a police officer, and what I saw that night was nothing like a bear. The animal was much too tall and had this very strange shape to its body. The head was much more boxy than any bear that I've ever seen. The entire encounter lasted about 5 minutes from the time I first saw this creature until it disappeared into the brush after that flash of light. I don't understand how the two are connected. This happened in August of 2017, when an officer who was patrolling a more remote area outside of Cincinnati saw something he never encountered before. His fellow officer also is a witness to the event. I was traveling down a dirt road that runs through some heavily wooded areas. The area is fairly well populated, but not many houses are located in the area that I was patrolling. As I drove along, I noticed a light in the woods to my right. At first, I thought it was a flashlight being used by someone walking through the woods. As I got closer, though, I realized that this was not the case. The light was far too large and bright for it to be a flashlight. I could see that the light appeared to be emanating through some type of large dish-shaped object that was partially hidden in the brush. From what I could tell, the object had a smooth metallic surface and appeared to be about 5 feet tall. I stopped my patrol car and stared at the object for a few minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I did not make any sound, and there were no other lights in this area, like from a house or street lights. Finally, I decided I should call for backup, and I cautiously approached the object with my flashlight and my weapon drawn. As I got closer, about 15 feet away, I could feel a slight vibration coming from the object. At that point, I decided to turn around and just wait for backup. As I turned around, I heard a very loud thump behind me. When I looked to see what it was, this object had risen 10 feet off the ground and was hovering above the brush. It started moving slowly towards me and began to make this low humming sound like an electric motor winding up. I was still heading towards my patrol car, and as I approached and got into the driver's seat, the object suddenly shot straight up into the air at a very high speed. It stopped about 100 feet above me and hovered there for around 30 seconds. At that point, it slowly descended towards the woods on the other side of the road, about 200 yards away, and disappeared behind some trees. Once it was out of sight is when backup arrived. I told my fellow officer what had happened, and we drove over to the other side of the woods to where it disappeared to. He got into my patrol car and we drove over together. As we approached, we could hear this low humming noise and felt this vibration through our bodies. That's when we both witnessed this object take off into the sky, leaving this vapor trail behind it that quickly disappeared. It was the strangest thing I've ever encountered during my 23 years of duty.